and welcome to another RLabs tutorial where I will introduce you to the paste function, which is actually very simple to use and understand. It probably won't come as a surprise to you that the paste function takes separate elements from separate vectors and pastes them together into a single element. So I'm just going to jump right in and show you some examples to demonstrate how this works. As a very basic example, let's say that we're working with birds, and to ID individuals we're recording the species, and we're assigning an ID number to each bird. So we're back in our studio now, and here's the ID info for one bird. It is a red-winged blackbird species, and it is bird number 1. So these are two different element types. One is a character element, as you see by the quotations, and one is a simple integer, just the number 1 with no quotations. And we want to paste these two elements together to make a single element. Now, as I said, we're working with two different data types here, but the paste function can take all the same data type as well. I could have input 2 characters or 2 integers if I wanted to. It all depends on the situation and what you want to accomplish. Now, also note that I have 2 separate elements in this example, but you can paste as many separate elements as you want to. Okay, so when I execute this command, you can see that the species and ID number have been squished together into a single character element. They're both within the same set of quotations. Now, instead of inputting the different elements directly into the paste function, it is also possible to assign the elements to separate variables first and then input the names of the variables instead. So let's give that a try. We will make a species vector containing the single character element red-winged blackbird, and we will make a number vector containing the single ID number 1. And then we can paste species and num together. And as you can see, we get the same output as before. Now I want to talk just for a minute about one of the optional arguments that you can specify in the function, and that is the sep argument, which controls how you want to separate the pasted elements when they become a single element. The default sep argument for the paste function is a space. As you can see, there is a space between red-winged blackbird and 1. So the default code would look something like this. Paste, open brackets, species, comma, num, comma, and then we write sep equals, and between quotations we simply add a space. And there we go. We obviously get the exact same output as we did without the sep argument because sep equals space is the default. Unless we specify otherwise, R assumes that we want this argument to apply to our paste function, and thus we don't even need to type it in. But if we don't like this space between the elements, we can separate the values by anything we want to, really. 2 common options would be to separate the elements by an underscore, so sep equals underscore, or by a period, and there it is there. But really you can separate the values by whatever you want to. Now notice that we have been pasting together the elements from 2 separate vectors, but what happens if we want to paste together the different elements of the same vector? Well, I can make an ID vector, for example, with 2 elements. One element is the species and the other is the ID number. Now, I had to make the ID number a character in this example, since a vector can only contain elements that are of a single data type. Okay, and we said we want to paste the 2 elements of the ID vector together. So let's give this a try. Well, you can see that it doesn't work at all. Red-winged blackbird and 1 are still 2 different elements. So this just goes to show you that you can only paste together elements that are from different vectors unless we alter the collapse argument, which is the argument that dictates whether or not the elements of a single vector can be combined together. The default is collapse equals null, meaning that the elements of a single vector cannot be collapsed. They cannot be combined. So since this is the default, the output matches the output that we got up here when we did not specify a collapse argument. But we can change that. When collapsing a vector, the collapse argument basically takes the place of the sep argument. So we can have collapse equals space, or we could have collapse equals an underscore, and so on and so forth. Now the examples that we've been working with so far are quite trivial since we've just been pasting together 2 elements. You probably won't ever use paste just to get 2 elements combined into 1. But one of the great features of paste is that it is a vectorized function. It can take in multiple vectors with lengths greater than 1, paste together the elements of the different vectors in a pairwise fashion, and then return a new vector with all of the pasted elements. So for example, instead of just having one species, red-winged blackbird, in our species vector, let's say that we have a red-winged blackbird, a mourning dove, an American robin, an American crow, and another mourning dove. And since that is 5 different birds, my num vector contains the ID numbers 1 to 5. And now we'll input these 2 vectors into the paste function and separate the pasted elements by an underscore. And then we get this nice output. As you can see, the first element of the output vector was created by pasting together the first element of the species vector and the first element of the num vector. Likewise, the second element of this output vector was generated by pasting the second elements of the other 2 vectors, and so on and so forth. So that's pretty handy. Now, what happens if the vectors that we want to paste together pairwise are not the same length? So for example, we will use the same species vector containing the 5 elements. But now let's change the num vector. Instead of containing the numbers 1 to 5, it will now contain the numbers 1 to 8. And now when we execute a paste function with species and num as the inputs, we might expect there to be an error, or at least for only 5 elements to be in the output, since the shortest vector is of length 5. But as you can see, we get a vector that is of length 8 as the output. And that is because the paste function is capable of recycling values. So let's take a look at what just happened. So here's the code that we typed into R. Here are the elements of the species vector, and here are the elements of the num vector. Now in terms of the output, it is easy to determine what the first 5 elements are. Simply the species and underscore and the corresponding ID number. I've color-coded the output here for you so that you can clearly see where the different parts of the output are coming from. Then for the remaining 3 elements of the output, the function has to recycle the elements of the species vector. So here's the entire species vector again, just to give you some context, and we start back at the beginning of the vector and reuse the first element, and then the second, and then the third. And we don't have to use the 4th and 5th again because the num vector is done now. Now here's a good example of when this recycling feature might come in pretty handy. Instead of just having the numbers 1 to 8 as ID numbers, let's say that we decide that we want to have bird 1, bird 2, bird 3, all the way up to bird 8. Well, we could certainly go through and make a new ID num vector by typing out the word bird 10 times and then the 10 corresponding numbers. But that is a lot of typing. And if you're anything like me, you probably like to take as many coding shortcuts as possible. So here's one shortcut that we can take. We simply paste together the character bird and our num vector, and what happens is that the bird character gets recycled over and over again such that it is pasted together with each of the 8 numbers in the num vector, as you can see here. Now because it is quite common to store data in data frames, I also want to briefly discuss how to use the paste function when data is in the form of a data frame instead of separate vectors. So here I have simply put the species vector and the num vector together in the form of a data frame called df. And now we can use the paste function by referring to the individual columns as the vectors to be pasted. Now recall that since the data frame is not attached in this case, I have to refer to the columns by indicating the name of the data frame, in this case df, followed by a $sign and then the name of the column. And then we will separate with an underscore again. And it's as easy as that. We get a nice vector return just like we did when using independent vectors rather than a data frame. I should also mention that as always in R, we can assign the output of any paste command to a variable so that we can refer to the output later on and then use the vector for other things. So here I'm calling up the same paste command that we just executed, but now I have assigned it to the variable called output. And then when we call up this variable, which is now an object in our global environment, we can see that a nice vector appears. In this specific case, since we're working with a data frame, we might want to get the output in the form of another column instead of an extra vector, and that is very easily done. We simply specify a new column in the data frame. Again, we do so by naming the data frame using a $sign and then writing the name of the new column, and I've called it output. And then we assign the same paste function to the new column. So here's the data frame now, and you can see that it now has a new column with all of the pasted values. Thanks for listening to this R Labs tutorial video. If you found this useful, You might be interested in our free online Moodle course, or check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel.